Her eyes are filled with terror. She is isolated and alone, and no one can help her. She turns to her last hope, hardly daring to believe that anything can truly change. This is the story of many women in our world. And this is the story of one particular woman that we find in Mark 5, known to us as the bleeding woman. Mark's story opens with a father who is pleading desperately for his sick and dying daughter. This father is no ordinary man, however. He is Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, a religious leader in the community. As Jesus goes to help Jairus, with the crowd swarming around him, a rather unnoticeable character enters the scene. She is a woman who has bled for 12 years. We know nothing special about her. She is unnamed. We do not know if she is old or if she is young. We don't even know where she is from. We only know that she is sick and that she is seeking help. The people around her, however, do not see her pain. They have eyes only for Jesus the teacher and Jairus, the synagogue leader. Because in our culture, we are taught to look at those who have power and influence, often neglecting to see the one who is powerless. To this world, the woman is unimportant. In addition, this woman is incredibly sick. She had in verse 25, a discharge of blood for 12 years and had suffered under the care of many physicians without getting any better. This bleeding perhaps caused her constant physical pain. She probably cried out to God day after day, pleading for him to heal her, wondering why he would not answer. All of us have experienced sickness on this earth. And whether it's for ourselves or for a parent, a grandparent, a child, we know what it is to plead for healing and to long for the wholeness of a person to be restored. This bleeding woman knew this longing for healing. And she had also experienced the stark reality that in this world, we have limitations. The woman had reached her financial limitation by seeking help from the doctors around her. The doctors had reached the limit of their skill by unsuccessfully attempting to treat her. This life on earth offered her nothing more. No one could heal her, no one could help her, and no one could even touch her. In fact, no one on earth would have even wanted to touch her. This discharge of blood that she had made her unclean by the purity laws of God. Leviticus 15:25 through 30 explains that because of this discharge of blood, anything that this woman touched, whether it was her bed or her chair or her friends or her family, would then also be unclean, meaning that they could not appear before God for sacrifice or for worship until atonement had been made for their uncleanliness. Unlike most women, however, this woman's bleeding never stopped. So for 12 years, she could not appear before God. For 12 years, society labeled her as an outcast, avoiding all physical contact with her. Constrained by the purity laws of the temple, perhaps she had begun to believe the lies that this earth had told her, that she was sick, that she was defiled, that she was untouchable. Labels such as these can be excruciatingly difficult to overcome, whether in our own thinking or in that of others. Currently, I am serving for my 3rd summer at Day Spring Villa, a women's shelter for women and children who are fleeing domestic violence and human trafficking. These women who come to us have been told by their abusers, by their families, sometimes even by their pastors, that they are worth nothing, that they have brought abuse and neglect upon themselves, that they deserve what they get. As a result, they believe that when he drags them through the yard by their hair, or when he forces them to have sex, or when he sells them for pornography, that they are worth nothing more than that, because that is what this earth has told them. Even us who follow Christ on this earth are so quick sometimes to judge them as outcasts, to skirt away from them, to turn away from their hurt. Like the bleeding woman, these ladies have nowhere else to turn. And in one last desperate snatch at hope, they call a shelter. One of our guests, who we will call Sarah, had the courage to make this call. Sarah grew up as a pastor's daughter, faithfully attending church and growing in her walk with Christ. However, when Sarah was 13, her father, who, like all of you, was supposedly a leader in this world for Christ, began to molest her. Over the next 10 years, Sarah's father molested her over 5,000 times. When Sarah came to us, she had been told by her husband and her father that she was worth nothing more than to be physically, sexually, and verbally abused. However, Sarah does not define herself by who the world has told her that she is. Our guests may come to us with very little hope, but we can share Christ with them. Sarah identifies herself no longer with who the world says she is. She instead defines herself by what Christ has done in her life. Christ, who came from the glory of heaven to live a life on earth, who showed us his power as he ministered to the sick and the broken and the unwanted. And when Christ interacts with this woman of Mark 5, he counteracts everything that the world has told her. As an outcast, she illegally makes her way through the crowd to Jesus, holding fast to the belief that if she just touched Jesus' garment, she would be healed. And it is this faith that allows her to see a glimpse of heaven's healing power, because as she touches Jesus' garment, she is immediately healed. Instead of making someone else defiled by her touch, the flow of blood dries up and she is clean. And as Jesus in verses 30 through 33 turns and asks, "Who touched me?" she falls at his feet, admitting everything to him. And rather than spurning her or humiliating her or turning his back, he looks at her and he says, "Daughter, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed of your suffering." Unlike the unsuccessful healing of the doctors, Jesus' healing is genuine and unlimited. Rather than labeling her an outcast, Jesus calls her daughter. And even though she is physically here on earth, she has had an experience with the wonder of heaven because of her faith. No longer constrained by the purity laws, she is now acceptable to God, and she is forever changed. She is free. Every single day, I pray for the freedom of our women and children at Dayspring, a freedom that can only come through Christ. Isaiah 61 commissions each and every one of us as God's people to care and bind up the brokenhearted and to free from captivity the prisoners. We as God's people are to see others through the eyes of heaven rather through the eyes of this earth. So before you give in to a momentary temptation, or before you turn your back on someone who is hurting, remember how God sees that person. And before you begin to believe the lies that this earth wants to tell you, remember how God sees you. We are here on earth where we experience sickness and suffering and hurting. However, we look forward to a day of restoration, a day when Christ will heal and redeem us, a day when we are no longer enslaved by the sin and the sorrow of this earth. We look forward to a day when we, like the bleeding yet healed by believing woman, will be overwhelmed by the love of our God through Jesus Christ. Yes. All of us, like our ladies at Dayspring and like the woman in Mark 5, have heard the lies that this earth tries to tell us when it says, you are sick, you are defiled, you are unwanted, you are unimportant, you are lacking, you are unclean. But Christ looks at us and says, you are pure, you are healed, you are mine, and I have made you whole. This, my friends, is my identity in the eyes of heaven. And this is how we are to view those around us who are suffering and hurting. Not as cast-offs or those that we can easily just turn our backs on, but as those who are beloved of God. So, will you believe the truth of your identity in heaven? And will you see those around you through heaven's eyes?